Welcome to today's presentation. We're going to be talking about America's favorite fruit or vegetable, the tomato. I love to eat tomatoes. I love to grow tomatoes. I love to talk tomatoes. So the tomato, if you ask a botanist, it's a fruit. But because we use it in so many savory foods, we think of it as a vegetable. Regardless, fruit or vegetable, it's wonderful to have in our diets, high in vitamin A and a strong source of lycopene, which is a powerful antioxidant for good health. Well, I don't need to convince you, the audience, of why you want to eat a tomato. What we want to talk about is growing them in your garden. Many gardeners would say, if I only have one tomato that I can grow, one plant that I could grow, it would be a tomato. And the reason is, if you look at the study that was done by recently by Washington State Extension, they said, what is the difference between one you grow in your garden and one you might buy in the store? And they looked at the differences in quality, production, and value. As far as quality, they rated it very high, that it's far superior to anything bought in the store. As far as production per square foot, that is the length of time and work of growing them, they said it was still superior to a store-bought, and relative monetary value, definitely far superior to what you buy in the store. So it's worth planting your and growing your own tomatoes. In order to help you be successful this year, we are having 3 seminars. The first today is going to focus on helping you to choose the variety that you want, the options for starting it from seed, and early care of seedlings. Then in about 5 weeks, we'll talk again about tomato varieties, because there may be some of you who wish to just buy yours from a nursery and have a seedling. Whether it's your tomato you've started or one you've purchased, we want to talk about how you're going to manage the growth of that seedling. And we stress the technique of potting up, which will help to develop strong roots, so we get them ready to plant out in the garden soil. And then May 3rd, we're going to help you recognize how you want to start planting them into the garden. It may be too early at that point, but you could be planning and thinking about it, getting your garden ready, and learning about the cultural practices and management to help minimize any risk of disease or pest. And we'll go take you right through the end of harvesting season to success with our information. Well, the objectives of today's class, first of all, if you're going to pick out a tomato, what would you grow it? The easiest way to do is learn the classification and all the varieties that are available and how to select them. It said there's over 10,000 different varieties and cultivars of tomatoes. So it can be overwhelming to think about, what do I want to grow? Well, also we will talk about the advantages, benefits, and challenges of growing from seed, and knowing when and how to start a tomato from seed. We'll also need to understand the effects of light, temperature, and moisture on the seeds, how best to manage them to have successful germination and growth. We'll want to understand the effects of light, temperature, and moisture, and then also to be able to choose a garden location for transplanting later in the season. So with these 10,000 varieties, how do we choose? Well, what does it mean for the use? That's the main thing to look at. We're going to look at how a scientist would classify tomatoes by genetics, by the growth pattern, and by their shape. By genetics, we're going to talk about heirloom versus hybrid. Now, an heirloom tomato, if you think about heirloom of any object, it's been handed down from generation to generation. For the tomato, it's an open pollinated, handed down, and you can count on planting that seed from that tomato each generation, as will result in the very same plant, the very same tomato. And that's why it has been able to hand it down generations after generation. Then there's the hybrid tomato, and this has been a crossbred, 2 different types of tomatoes for parents that have good qualities, and when they combine them, they work towards finding a tomato that is even a better tomato, more disease resistant, better yields, higher production. The thing to remember is the seed production then is not true to the original plant. Some people feel a hybrid sometimes plant can be sacrificed to flavor. I don't know that that's always true, but it depends on the particular variety maybe you're looking at or the cultivar. It's generally the supermarket tomatoes are generally considered to be hybrids because they have been bred to travel long distance and sit on a supermarket shelf. You'll often hear the terms variety and cultivar used, and they are used interchangeably, but they are not the same. And I'll just take a minute here and describe that. When we hear talk about a variety of plant, those are what occur natural in nature. They're true to type. Seedlings from the parent have the same characteristics. So that would be an heirloom. When we speak of cultivar, that word is coined from the terms cultivated variety. These are plants that have been selected and cultivated by humans, and they produce a different plant than the parent. So reproduction is done then by propagating or grafting. So we have the terms heirloom and hybrid. Also want to talk a little minute about a grafted. The grafted plant is a combination of a vigorous rootstock and a scion, which is grafted on the top. So this could be one of your favorite heirlooms that is a little difficult to grow. And when it's grafted onto a vigorous rootstock, it is driven to a production that is far superior to what the original conventional plant had. It can be more disease resistant. I've often harvested 4 to 5 times the amount of tomatoes from a grafted that I did from a conventional. They are expensive to buy and very, very difficult to graft, but you will see a difference in the disease and the production. And if you try to save the seed, it'll go back to the original scion that was grafted. Well, in addition to genetics, we want to consider maybe the growth pattern of the plant. And that was basically can be identified the length of time it takes to produce and the structure of the plant. So there's 2 different types in this category, the determinate and the indeterminate. Of course, the word determinate means it's just a very determined time that will grow and ripen and be done, and the size it will get to. So it's more of a bush. You see here one that's in a pot on a patio. This crop is ripening all in the same time with a very short time of 2 to 3 weeks. It's an excellent type of a tomato to grow for canning because your crop will come on quite a bit at the same time, making it easier to harvest. It's a good plant to grow in a pot because it is a bush. You don't need to stake it usually. And you can see that the stems end with a fruit cluster and they're spaced very close together. So they're very, very dense. Now contrast that with an indeterminate, which instead of being a bush is a vine, and it will grow and grow and grow until frost. And you can harvest it over a longer period of time. It will need staking because as you can see how large it is. The overall yield is generally higher, but here it is a good contrast. The determinate, everything's ripe and ready to pick. It's a small bush. Here's the determinate. It's grown high, would need to be staked. You see some ripe tomatoes, some that are starting to ripen, some that are small, and up here are blossoms yet to even be pollinated and grow. So this is a long-term crop here. So the indeterminate, the stem ends with another shoot. That's why it just keeps growing and gets so large. The fruit clusters are spaced apart. And for that reason, I think sometimes the fruit seems to taste better. It seems to get a little more sunshine. There's more leaves. So therefore, you're going to have more photosynthesis, which results in more sugars. And more leaves sometimes can help keep the plant a little healthier because there's more leaves before it actually defoliates. Well, another consideration is selecting it by the shape. And this is basically as how do you want to use your tomato crop? There's the shape called the globe, which I think can refer to the slicer. There's the beefsteak, paste, and cherry. Let's start by talking with the cherry. It's such a popular type of tomato. These are often called the patio or pixie tomatoes. They're wonderful for salads or just plain eating out of the garden. I've grown most of the ones I've seen listed here for you. They're wonderful and just so versatile, as you can see the beautiful colors. A mutation of the cherry has resulted in the grape and the pear cultivars. They're usually a meatier, chewier texture, little different shape, lots of different colors. Sometimes the flavors are described as slightly tart. The currant tomato, so named because it's so small, like a little currant, is an indeterminate, highly disease resistant, high yielding, high sugar content, firm, juicy texture. That might be an interesting one to try. It's very, very sweet. Oregon State has a publication that lists the cultivars. Here you see the cherry and grape, and you're going to notice that these are the tomatoes that ripen the earliest. Here's some early ones to mid-season. This is just a few. Some are determinate, semi-determinate, different colors, but you will see your earliest ripening are the cherry tomato cultivars. Then there's the paste. For those of you who like to make salsas and sauces, it's a wonderful tomato. It has more meat, less juice, and so it can be put into those sauces or dried much easier. Here's a few popular varieties: San Marzano and the Amish paste, or Blue Beach. They're wonderful tomatoes. Here's also another chart from Oregon State on the cultivars. You'll notice some of these, on this particular chart is a Parthenocarpic, which means it's seedless, that's developed by Oregon State University. Again, you see I have a few that are early and some mid, some determinate. These are some of the slicers. Wonderful for sandwiches and salads, an easier tomato to harvest, and the size is quite manageable. A couple of these, again, also have no seeds, developed by Oregon State, Santiam and Siletz. Slicer tomatoes, there's a nice variety of these to grow. Again, you're going to see the tomato gets larger, then the maturity comes later. Some of these are mid-season, some late. Now, the beefsteak, of course, is one that people love to enjoy bragging about. This is a Big Zack, which is a nice big tomato. They do harvest the very latest. Takes the longest to grow a large tomato, and they can be used for slicing, salads, sandwiches. Pretty well fills a hamburger bun and overlaps sometimes. Here's a picture of some of the heirloom beefsteaks. Lots of varieties, lots of wonderful tastes. Well, we talked about scientific ways of choosing them, but another way to pick a tomato is just from what you like and what your neighbor says tastes best. And so in the past, it's been kind of a subjective thing about which is the best tasting tomato. But I recently read about the use of the Brix test. Now the Brix test is an acronym for a test that is applied to grapes by the wineries to check the sugar content. And so they've been now checking tomatoes and saying which tomatoes have the highest Brix test results. The higher the score on the Brix test, the higher the number, then the higher the number of sugars are present in the fruit. And that's been an indicator of vegetable quality. Now, if you compare the scores, here's another reason to grow your own. Look at the score of the store-bought tomatoes between 3 to 5, and look at homegrown cherries, 12 to 13. Cherry tomatoes do have the highest tomato score on the Brix. Indeed, vive la difference. Well, maybe you're still not sure which one to want to pick, because what really matters to you is how long does it take to mature. Maybe you want to plan a vacation, or you want to plan some to can, and you need to know which one's going to be ready when you want it ready. So look at that and consider the days of maturity. They can go quite a broad span, from 50 days for an early girl. A larger mortgage lift or a beefsteak might take 80 to 90 days. Or maybe you're concerned about disease or problems in the gardening. You say, I don't want to be spraying, so maybe I want one that's really disease resistant, and you can find that also with your tomatoes. What you're going to do now is check the seed packet, because the seed packet will tell you which one is resistant to the following diseases? And you'll see these letters on the seed packet. We'll talk a little bit about some of these diseases in the third session of my tomato webinars. Well, you're still wondering whether you want to start from seeds? Well, do you want to sow the seeds or do you want to buy the seedling plant? Let's compare. The seeds, the availability is absolutely the greatest. You'll have, especially from the catalogs, you'll find thousands of tomatoes that are available through if you plant the seeds. Still pretty good from the seedling plants, generally not quite as many as available. If you're itching to get started early, you can start with seeds. However, if you don't want to, you can start later when you just buy the plant. The cost is the lowest if you're going to buy seeds. It's still cheaper to buy a seedling plant than to buy the tomatoes in the store, but it is more expensive. There's way more varieties with seeds versus what you're going to buy because you're limited to what the nursery wanted to plant. And you have the joy of raising a plant from seed to harvest. Some hybrids are disease resistant. Maybe you want to choose the seedling. Whichever, let's get started. And today we'll talk about starting from seed. So first one, research your needs and the preferences and the information that we talked about, how to choose it. That'll be one of the things you'll want to consider. Then when you've made your decision, you want to purchase the seeds. And again, you can use a catalog. They're wonderful to get in the mail, or you can request them online and look. You may go just to your garden store and buy them. There's also many counties have seed libraries that you can visit to pick up seeds. When you pick up that seed packet, it's good to look at it and understand what it's telling you. First of all, it tells you the variety. This pack is a San Marzano. The use, it's a sauce or a paste tomato. The growing pattern, it's an indeterminate. The harvest time is 90 days. So that's the information on the front of the pack. Then if you turn it over, there's more information for you. It'll tell you the year it's packed. And generally, seeds are good for about 2 to 3 years. So those seeds, this pack is still good for this year. It'll tell you when to sow it indoors, 6 to 8 weeks before transplant date, how to plant it. It tells you the depth and the soil temperature and the days to germinate, all this information. And then it tells you when to thin the plants, tells you how to, this one is, and tomatoes are, for our area, are not recommended to plant indoor or to sow outside in the garden as a seed. Tells you about fertilization, the viability of the seed, and the germination rate. Information as you're buying those tomato seed packets. So you decide what you want, you bought the seed packet. Now it's time to say, well, what are the materials that I need? Does it matter what I plant the seeds in? Yes, it does. You're going to say, can I use garden soil or potting mix? No. You need a special product called a seedling medium. The seedling medium is much lighter. Potting soil is too dense. So in your shopping for it, it may be called a germinating or a seed starting mix. It is a blend of peat moss or coconut coir, perlite, calcium silicate, and a wetting agent. The seedling mix maximizes the potential for the seeds to germinate. Potting soil is too dense and garden soil is way too dense and may contain pathogens and weed seeds. So they've got your seedling mix, and now you're going to get, what are you going to put it in? Let's start with a traditional way of putting it into a tray. You want to start with a small pot, 1 to 3 inches at the largest, or maybe even a tray with cells. You're going to plant it in something very small, and then it will need to be repotted up several times. And this is a good practice because it helps with root development. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about a different system than using plastic cell trays. You know, our ancestors didn't have plastic, and so they made cell blocks when they were just gather a bunch of soil together and put the seed in that to get it started. The seedling mix when we use soil blocks is both the container and the growing medium. There's no plastic containers. And the phenomenon called air pruning, which we'll talk about, eliminates a pot-bound plant. Soil blocks can lead to remarkable health of transplants compared to their cousins grown in cell trays. Well, what does a soil block look like? Well, it's made from a tool that looks like this. It has four little compartments there that you're going to press the soil medium into and pack it tight. It has on the underside these protrusions that make holes in the soil for the seed to go into. You can see there's large soil blocks and small and even a homemade one. Well, briefly, if you're going to make a soil block, you mix the planting medium, you get it very, very wet, almost dripping wet. You fill those little soil blockers and then pack them in tight, place it on a bottom tray and release it. It has a spring on it on the handle, and then the soil blocks will come out. When we make soil blocks, we use these following 6 items. Of course, peat moss or coconut coir, perlite, worm castings, a blended cow manure, lime, and a mixture of equal parts blood meal, phosphate, and green sand for a fertilizer. The mixture needs to be wet, really wet, and it's best to use a warm water and pack very densely while it's wet. You're going to mix it 1 part water for every 3-part mix, and a lot of the success of having it hold together is it needs to be wet enough. When you make them, then you're going to put the blocks onto an open tray. You're going to water from the bottom. And a seed doesn't have to be covered. You're going to put the seed into it, and you'll place it on the heat mat and then begin hydration. There's the germination's complete, and you'll take the cover off when it goes to like this and keep it under the grow lights. Let's talk just a little bit about air pruning. Why is it better? If you grow in a soil block, it gets a really stronger root system. There's more oxygen that's to the roots, and it naturally prunes. What that means is that it doesn't hit the sides of the plastic and then go around and around. It reaches the edge of the soil and just stops. Reaches that edge and it'll stay there until it's placed in more soil, and then it will continue to grow. So you don't have a root-bound or a pot-bound plant. It's also, I think, favorable because it's a more sustainable way to grow from seed. You don't have plastic containers, and you're noticed by the next mixture that I gave the recipe for that has a lot of soil nutrients that even your soil mixin doesn't have. Well, just something to think about in all of your planting is that coconut coir is renewable. It's a byproduct of food industry and pH neutral. Peat moss is more acidic, difficult to re-wet, and the most important thing is obtained by strip mining. So it is a product that is, according to Linda Brewer, who wrote an article at Oregon State University, it contributes to climate change when we harvest peat moss. So I think next time, if you want to start looking at the products you're buying, look to see if they have peat moss as a huge ingredient, or to see if you can find any products that maybe have the coconut coir as a substitute. Last thing I'll say about it is a quote by Elliot Coleman, who's written a lot on organic gardening, and he has developed a lot of techniques on soil blocking. He says it's an ingenious seed starting method that allows the grower to produce vigorous seedlings with roots that quickly reestablish growth upon transplanting. Soil blocking further eliminates the expense, waste, and storage issues associated with plastic pots. Well, whether you're going to plant in plastic pots or soil blocks, the main thing to get now is we need to decide, when are we going to start? So the guidelines for starting to plant from your seeds, and this is from a handout by 10-Minute University, we advise counting back from the local last frost in your region, and you estimate 5 to 7 weeks before that last frost. Now, in the Willamette Valley, that's usually the first couple of weeks of May is when the last frost is. So the middle of March is a good time to start planting the seeds. If you're not in the Willamette Valley, as many of you viewers aren't, you'll look at your National Climate Data Center for your information about your frost in your area. What materials do we need? Well, optimally, it would be nice to have a controlled heat mat and thermostatically controlled and a grow light in a greenhouse, but that isn't possible for everybody. So let's talk about how we can grow them using a variety of methods. Start with your open tray with a dome lid and a plastic bag cover for the cells that you're going to use, or maybe you can do the soil block. Again, you need an open tray and cover. Regardless of the method, you need moist seedling mix, the seeds, the labels, and a warm environment of 65 to 70 degrees. Well, that's the question now, is it going to be warm enough? You need to consider temperature. In order for a seed tomato to germinate, the soil temperature needs to be 65 to 85 degrees. You get that by using a heat mat. It's nice if it could be thermostatically controlled. You could leave it on 24 hours a day. I do want to caution that after germination occurs, it may be advisable to remove the trays from a heat mat, and we'll talk about that later in today's program. But your ambient temperature should be around 60 to 70 degrees. So it's in your house or in a greenhouse or some method that can be kept that warm. Also important to consider is the light. New seedlings require light to grow. They, in fact, need 10 to 16 hours of light per day, and that's hard to get in the spring. So think about some kind of an augmentative light system. UV light, ultraviolet light is really helpful to develop strong, healthy plant growth. So the three things we'll talk about are the fluorescent, LEDs, or incandescent. Regardless of which light you use, you want to be able to adjust the height of that light as the plant grows. You want to start at about 2 to 3 inches above the seedling and then raise it as the plant height increases. Well, here's the first system, the LED light system. Generally considered the ultimate way to grow them. It's very energy efficient. It's long lasting, has a wide spectrum of light, which the plants love. All those different colors affect growth and the leaves in different ways and are very beneficial. It doesn't produce much heat, and it comes in a wide variety of styles and sizes. The negative aspect is when you're first investing, it is a higher cost up front. Then there's the fluorescent bulb, which many of us have in our home. Nice thing is it's pretty efficient. It's cheaper upfront cost. Some can produce different spectrums. You'll have to kind of see. Others don't have quite a wide spectrum. The negative part is it doesn't last as long as the LEDs, and it uses more energy than an LED. Then there's the incandescent bulb, which many of us just still have in our home. It's the cheapest upfront cost. It's inefficient, and the main thing about it is it creates a heat which can dry out the soil and actually burn your plant leaves. So, and it doesn't last as long in most cases. It does not have the UV rays that the fluorescent and LEDs do. And with that type of light, it can cause the plants to stretch. So it's the least advisable type to use. You don't have grow lights? For years, I put them in the window, and that will work fine. A nice sunny window on the south side. Try to avoid north because you need a direct light, but growing in a sunny window works just fine. Look at those plants, they're doing well. So let's get started. We've got our seedling mixed. I'm going to put a lot of moisture in to get it nice and wet, and I've got my tray to plant it in. First, I'm going to, after a couple hours of having that seedling mix moisturized, I'm going to start packing the soil into the trays. Pat it down gently. I don't want to have any holes in it. And then I'm going to make 2 holes in each little tray. I like to plant 2 to increase the germination possibility and percentage. I can just use my fingers, put them down about 1/4 to 1/3 of an inch. Then I take my seeds, and 1 per hole, and then I'll cover it with about 1/4 of an inch of soil, the seedling mix. Pat it down gently, and then I'm going to moisten that plant mix. Take a little spritzer or a sprayer of water gently onto the surface of the seedling mix. And then the next thing to do is cover it with either a plastic bag, or if you've bought a tray, they often come with covers. You need to do that to hold the moisture in. If it's on a heat tray, a heat mat, it will warm it up and you'll get so much evaporation, your little seedlings will never have enough moisture to germinate. So keep it covered. So here we are with the optimum setup for our traditional planting in the cells. We have a heat mat, we've got a cover, labels, and lights. Let's review a little bit about moisture. You're going to moisten the seedling mix a few hours before planting, and then you're going to moisten after you've planted it with a spritzer. Then I want to introduce the concept of bottom watering. Do that as needed when the seedlings are up, and try to use a tepid water to avoid shocking the seedlings. And every so often, about once or twice a week, I will add a water-soluble fertilizer, dilute strength, about a quarter of the strength, and when I'm trying to hydrate them. Here's bottom soaking or bottom watering. Now this is a picture of plants further along. The seedlings that you're going to be talking about in this session are much smaller, not so well developed. But this principle is that you're going to soak them in another larger pan with some tepid water. You could add some fertilizer to that water if you wanted to. You place them in there and let it soak up the water until all of the soil in the block or cell is totally saturated. Then you'll drain it well and return it to the protected environment. This is a really superior way of watering. The plant goes to the roots, not all over the leaves, and it gets a nice, thorough watering. Whether it's soil blocks or cells, we're going to get ready for the heat mat and the grow lights. And that's what's happening now. And we're going to, while we're waiting for the germinate, we've got them all set up to grow. We're going to think about walking outside and think about the garden. Where do we want to plant them? What's the location that's good? So you need to consider that as well. For a tomato to really grow healthy and to produce nice tomatoes, you need to have minimum 8 hours of sun. You want to have a loamy, well-drained soil. You want to be protecting them from the wind. But you also want to avoid low spots because that's where air will stagnate, water will collect and not drain well. So that's four things to remember: hours of sun, the soil, and the environment. Now, many of us don't have a space big enough for growing in the garden. So we're going to think about using a container. Works very well for many tomato plants. While you're thinking about what you're going to buy for seeds, you might want to say, I need to plan about my container as well. It's best to have a fairly large one, 4 to 5 gallons per plant. It doesn't matter what it's made out of. What matters is if it's just going to allow for good drainage. There's lots of good cultivars. I've listed just a few here. Basically, what you want to do is look at some of the pastes that are smaller, or the determinants are nice in there, and definitely the cherry tomatoes grow well and do well in a pot. The nice thing is with the cherry tomatoes, you can sometimes get by with just 6 hours of sun versus the 8. But a container garden, a tomato is a wonderful plant in a container. Well, guess what? Our seedlings have sprouted. We're going to take the dome off. There is what we see. They're looking good. Now we need to maintain the air temperature of 65 to 75 degrees. And we're going to keep the grow light 2 inches above the seedling. So we may have to be lifting it up. We're going to check every day for moisture and use room temperature water. Again, just a gentle spritzer or to the soil, or bottom watering if possible. Make sure that there's good airflow. You could just walk by and kind of wave your hand over them or have a light fan occasionally. Now, you might have a few problems, and I have faced these, but they can easily be remedied if we know what's causing them. Look at the stems on these. There's hardly any leaf at the top, just a long, spindly stem. What causes that? Leggy, spindly, or tilty seedlings can be caused by insufficient light. You see them just reaching for light. Excessive heat from the heat mat. Remember, I told you earlier that when they start to sprout, take them off the heat mat. And I have left mine on too long and get long, spindly stems. They don't need the heat mat so much after they've generated. They need light. Could be that you've got a poor growing medium or not enough moisture. Well, another thing that can happen is some diseases. I've had this too. This is called damping off, and you can see where the fungal disease has attacked the stem. Basically, it's going to strangle that little tomato plant so we can't get nutrients. That is called damping off. You want to prevent it as best possible. Use sterile medium and sterile pots. Try to maintain a steady temperature. Water from the bottom or sprinkle just the soil surfaces, not the leaves. If you develop it, I'm sorry to say there's no remedy. You just have to throw away plants, soil, and pots. It needs to all be discarded. Well, good thing to remember, because I remind myself of this: mistakes are tools for learning. Evaluate your trials. Making mistakes is a sign you're trying to do things better. There's usually little penalty for mistakes if you learn from them. Well, look at that. We've got good progress. You're going to notice here, there's a nice length of the stem, and we have the leaves. These are called cotyledons or energy leaves, and they're the first to appear. And as the plant continues to progress, it starts to produce the true leaves of that plant. You'll recognize these as tomato leaves. And now it's time to take a look at the fact that it's crowded in that little pot. So it's time to thin them if there's two in a pot. And you don't want to pull it out. If you pull it out, the roots may be intertwined and you'll disturb the roots of the one you want to leave. So I just take a pair of scissors and cut right at the soil level. And I pick the one that looks like it's the least viable. This one's not so impressive as this one. Same here, I would take this one out too. Again, I plant 2 per tray because I want to have really good germination for not too many trays. And that's up to you whether you want to do it, whether you have enough seeds to do that or not. Check your plants regularly and often. My plants now are 4 to 5 inches tall, and they're going to require potting up. It's time to promote them. I've made sure that they've got fertilized and watered well. Now it's time to pull one out and say, how does it look? Look at this plant. This came out of a cell, and look at all those roots. This plant needs to go into a larger pot with more soil. This is the challenge of putting it into the pot, because those roots have just kind of circled and circled around. Interestingly enough, look at this. This came from a soil block procedure. You don't see any of those roots. They've all been air pruned. But when this goes into another larger pot, those roots will take right off and grow, and it will do very well. Well, let's just review. Remember, don't use your garden soil to start your seedlings. Possibility with pathogens, weed seeds, and it's way too compact. The seeds needs oxygen and warmth and water, and they can't get that if you use your garden soil. For early feeding, dilute water-soluble fertilizer is used. Keep the seedlings close to the light source. And stress them with some air circulation, a fan for get the stems will be sturdier that way, just for a couple hours a day. Well, next webinar will be March 29th, and that's when we will talk about that plant that looks like this or this. I doubt your plant will look like that when we have the seminar, but we'll be ready to talk about getting it ready to plant. Because potting up is a wonderful technique to develop a healthy plant. We'll get you ready to put it out in your garden soil, whether you have bought it or have planted it. And then our third one will be planting into the garden, helping you learn the cultural practices and techniques to grow your plant to minimize the risk of any disease or pests. So I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. Again, growing tomatoes is a wonderful experience, and you can have a lot of good success. There are some challenges, but we want to walk you through them as we each one of these webinars. I've listed here in the next 3 slides. You'll see the publications from Oregon State, as well as the helpline address, and also the address to find the videos and handouts from the 10-Minute University. I've also included a couple of pages of some of the resources I've used in developing this presentation, and those will be available for you to peruse when you get your chance to see this again as a recorded session. I'm going to welcome now Sherry Shang. Are you there, Sherry?
Here I am. Can you see me?
Welcome. I can. Welcome.
Great presentation. Thanks so much, Amelia. We have some questions. And the first question is about heat mat.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like you are pretty experienced with using it. Can you tell folks who are new to it about perhaps choices, what to look for, different types? Some comparison if somebody's wanting to shop for one.
When we first started doing this, we had heat mats we bought several years ago, and they were not thermostatically controlled. You just rolled them out, plugged them in, and there they were. We still use them, but I much prefer, and I think most of the ones you'd buy nowadays would be thermostatically controlled. They roll up easily for storage. And so I think that I can't really make much more recommendation. I think if you just go and say, I'd like to buy a heat mat, I don't know that there's a huge variety. Again, just try to see if you can get a thermostatically controlled one. You don't want to use an electric blanket or a heating pad that you would use on your body because you're going to get water on it some way or another. And so you do need to have the heat mat that's designed for growing plants.
Great. And there are some questions associated with the making soil blocks. And this is probably something that many of us know about vaguely, but we have not done it. And you have had quite a bit of experience with soil block making. So could you talk a little bit more about the raw ingredients? You flashed a slide on the screen really quickly. So if you could review that and talk a little bit about perhaps your experimentation with how to vary the percentage of different input in making soil blocks, and that would be really helpful.
Sure. Actually, if you Google soil block making, there's a lot. It's just like making brownies. There's a lot of different recipes. And some of them only have 2 or 3 ingredients. The main thing is you've got to have something that will really bind it to tight, because the soil block doesn't have a container. You don't want it falling apart. And that's one of the biggest challenges I suppose we've had, is making sure that it has a ability to stay tightly held together. We add a lot to our soil blocks. I think if I can remember, we've got the coconut coir. We have the fertilizer, which we have mixed of blood meal, green sand, and phosphate. We have lime and a blended cow manure. And that's for perlite. That's 5 ingredients. As I say, if you go online, you're going to see a lot of different recipes. We've used Elliot Coleman's recipe. The experience, the one thing I probably didn't mention is, if you had noticed when I showed the seeds in the soil block, you don't cover the seed. It stays just in that little hole. And that's kind of surprising, because you always think you need to cover it, but you don't. In fact, I think it does well. It has good access to oxygen and moisture, and it's sending the roots down, not up anyway. So let's see, does that answer some of the questions about it? The challenge, like I say, the biggest challenge is keeping it to stay together. I will tell you a funny thing happened, though, not so funny, but we were growing the tomatoes in the soil blocks in a greenhouse. They were on the floor of the greenhouse on heat mats, and the there was a whole bunch of them where nothing came up, and we looked and there was no seed. And we knew that we had put the seeds in, and then we discovered ants had come in and of course, because the seed's exposed and in the hole, they just carried the seed off. So that's one thing to think about. But soil blocks take more time, but I think they're a way to think about gardening in the future. If you were going to have a small amount of seeding, I wouldn't bother. They're work, and I'm going to have to mix up all the ingredients and get that ready. But and you do need to buy the soil blocker. But once you invest in it and start doing it, I think you'll say, wow, I really like doing this. One thing to consider is when you look at the hole that makes, you really can't plant a squash seed in it. It's too big. So it's more for the smaller seeds.
So Susan wants to know if she can use rabbit poop instead of manure or, worm casting as a nutrient input.
Oh, worm casting. That was the other. Yeah, you're eating. I have not familiar at all with using that kind of a manure. So it's a matter of, I guess, how hot it is, how well it mixes into your recipe. I don't have a tendency to use raw manure at all. Haven't had good luck with it. So I'm buying a bagged blend of cow manure.
Okay, so there is a question about manure as a source of potential pathogen, but you're making it clear it's already composted and it's pretty clean to start out.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, we buy the bagged to be sure. We've purchased from or even just had friends that have dropped off some what they quoted was composted manure, but it later on proved to be a problem with they had used some 2,4-D on it, on the grass that the cows ate. And so it stayed in the manure. So you're best to just invest in a blended or a treated composted manure.
And somebody asked a question about coconut fiber, wanting to know if that can be reused. And I'm guessing you mentioned coconut fiber as part of the soil block ingredient. And I'm guessing you're planting the entire block of material into the soil, so there really is no opportunity for reusing.
No.
Okay. Could you talk about fertilizing the seedling? People have some questions. It sounds like if you use soil block, you don't need to add fertilizer, but if you do it the conventional way, you do.
Right. Yeah. The soil block mixture we have has enough nutrients. Again, that fertilizer blend that I talked about, we don't need to have it. But if you're using a commercial seedling mix, it does not have those nutrients. And so I would use a water-soluble fertilizer, diluted, and just use it in however you're watering it. Again, ideally bottom watering. And then that's the fertilizer you would use. The seedling mix does not have the nutrients the soil block does.
And how do you water the soil block without making it fall apart?
Well, you put bottom watering is the only way you can do it.
Okay.
Well, I shouldn't say that. You can use a spritzer, but again, it's packed tight enough that it stays. You can pick it up and move it around easily. Huh. It's like a hard brownie.
Okay. Okay. You've talked about when you advise people to start with their seeds. Mm-hmm. Could you say a little bit more about perhaps variations to that starting date? Because some people are going to start seeds with no heat mat. Some people are going to start with no grow light. Perhaps you talk a little bit about, kind of the bare minimum equipment, less than ideal situations, and how much longer perhaps that will take for the seedling to get ready.
So we talked about it was about 6 to 8 weeks. I would start it maybe at 8 weeks, but I think you'll find it will start to catch up. I have started them with the lights and the heat mat and found that they grew too fast. And I had a plant that was ready to go in the garden way before I wanted to put it in the garden. So it's okay if it isn't huge or gallon size by the time you want to put it in the garden.
All right.
Does that help? You want to say a timeline, let's say 8 weeks. So 2 months before you want to put it in the garden, and let's say that's toward the end of May, middle to end of May, then you'd want to start it. You could still start it at the end of March.
And perhaps one point about tomatoes is since they are planted much deeper than the other vegetables into the garden, this is something that you will talk about in the next two presentations. But if people start tomato seeds indoors under less than ideal conditions and the seedling is, less than stout, let's say, there is an opportunity through the potting up process to plant it deeper and encourage the better growth. So we probably should encourage people to start from seeds, even if they don't have ideal conditions.
Oh, absolutely. I see homes where I've gone in and there's a nice batch of plants on the windowsill in the sun. And there's no heat mat. The heat mat is just to help it germinate faster. So it'll still germinate if you've got a warm environment. Germinating faster, I think, helps it to be a little a greater percentage of germination possibility. But it'll still germinate in a warm room. And if you put it under your fluorescent light or in the windowsill, it's still going to grow. Plants love to grow, and it'll make it. And as you mentioned, Sherry, by continually potting it further into new soil so that the roots can grow and develop a strong root system, you can have a wonderful plant.
So there is a question about a variety of different approaches of doing soil block making. And I think we should just emphasize you are providing some resources and links for folks who are interested to read more and experiment with soil block making. Should we tell folks if they are interested that they should email the 10-Minute U email address, because we have a hands-on workshop coming up in March where everyone will get a chance to make their soil block and plant seeds to take it home?
Sure, that's fine. We do have a kind of a limited amount of people who can come, but the class is not full yet. So if they want to look at it, to see about possibly signing up. We do plan on teaching it. We'll have all the materials there, and you'll be able to take home some soil blocks.
So let's just encourage folks to email 10-Minute U. The class is scheduled for Tuesday, March 7th at 1 o'clock, and it's hands-on. It's in Oregon City, Oregon, so only local folks might want to consider that.
Yeah, all right. It's at Hopkins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move on to some other questions. People are curious about the different spectrum of light, full spectrum bulbs versus blue or purple light in terms of encouraging seedling growth in tomatoes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Out of my head, no, but I do know that there's red and green and blue and yellow. And at different times, they are different to enhance the growth of your plant. So I'd have to pull something up on some paper. I've read about that, and I think the red and the green is generally preferable. But again, you think about what comes from the sun, we get ultraviolet, and those. You can look at the spectrum of what you're growing, and probably at different times, whether you want it to develop more leaves or whatever, different spectrums and different plants, different whether you're growing tomatoes might write a different color of light than say your beets or something else that you want to be growing. I would say if you end up buying LEDs, before you buy it, look at what you are going to be largely growing and trying to germinate and grow inside, and then decide how you want to set them. We have one set of LEDs that I can adjust the spectrum. The others are all set. So if you're going to invest in LEDs, take a look around to see what there is and look at what you're going to grow, what the spectrum is needed best.
Great. Somebody asked a question about a kind of container that's called 801 containers. Are you familiar with that? No?
Nope.
Okay.
I know there's peat pots. That's what but no, 801 I don't know.
All right. And someone else ask a question about fungus gnats. Have you had experience? Any tips for how to deal with them?
Well, that's interesting. I just visited a company that produces traps for such things, and I saw this owner of the company had one on the window and the plants in front of the window, and his little trap was covered with fungus gnats. So he was saying that that's a good product because look what I caught. So uh, there are traps and probably just sticky paper because if you put it next to your plant, that sticky paper will catch them.
Yeah,
I've
great.
never had trouble with them, but it was amazing what his little product was catching.
Well, I suppose fungus gnat usually it's a byproduct of bagged, potty mix. So, but if you're doing soil blocks, you may not have that problem.
Yeah, I've never had it, but it's obviously coming from someplace. When I showed the pictures of damping off, we had it one time and we were doing nothing different, and somehow it developed. And I'm sure it came in what we were using for a medium, or perhaps somewhere it was contaminated.
Okay. Someone in attendance just emailed us saying that the 801 containers are the 4-inch square containers used in nurseries.
Oh.
And it's used for seed starting and then later on transplanted. All right.
Well, I would go a little smaller because then I transplant up from if I'm going to use a cell, I would probably transplant up to a 4-inch and then a larger after that. The more times that I transplant that, well, I didn't, not transplant, potting, the more times I pot that up, the stronger the plant's going to be. And that's a little bit of work, I know. But if you start with a 4-inch, then you're going to have, it'll sit in that for a fair amount of time before you need to repot it. And then you'd probably go to an 8-inch and then you'd probably go to the garden and from there. And I would say start small. Start with a small container, and it makes you have to repot, pot it up, and that's actually a very good technique. The health of a plant is determined by the health of the roots. The better root system you can develop, and that comes from repotting up, then the better off your plant will be.
That's a really good point that you said use initially a smaller cell for seed starting, because if we give it a 4x4 size, there's actually more surface area to keep moist, potentially more surface area to deal with fungal pathogen, etc. So only use a size that's needed as opposed to too large.
Yeah, even our soil blocks are I don't think they're more than 2 inches square. Yeah.
Well, that's great, Amelia. We have answered all the questions. Siggy Schwartz, you asked a question about eggs of fungus gnats. That's something that I'd encourage you to email the 10-Minute U email address, and we can address that separately. So let's see. Ooh, now all of a sudden a whole bunch of questions came in because we're wrapping up. Okay, so somebody says that she has used old school paper egg cartons for seed starting.
Yeah.
Does that sound like a good idea?
I think the challenge is how to keep it covered, but no, that's going to disintegrate. I would think, I would hope as you repot it or pot it up, that would disintegrate. I think the main thing is that's pretty small, so you're going to have not a lot of roots to develop. Keep it covered with a plastic bag. Doesn't come with anything commercial, of course, but you're going to want to repot up soon. And I would assume, because I put egg cartons in the compost, that eventually that would break down. But I would be more inclined to peel that off. You don't want those roots to have to be spending all their time trying to get through the egg carton into the next soil. So I've never used egg cartons. I do. A lot of people do.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Amelia. Wonderful presentation. This is just the first of a series of 3. The next one coming up, we'll talk about how to pot up and encourage growth of a strong-rooted tomato plant before it goes out into the garden. And then the final one in early May, Amelia is going to talk about cultural best practices. So that includes pruning and supporting and your plant and disease management. watering, fertilizing, all the things that we gardeners would like to know. So until next time, I see more questions are coming in. So folks, you're just going to have to email 10MinuteU 2017, that the email address that's in your Zoom confirmation. Feel free to email us your questions and we'll be happy to answer them offline. All right. Thank you again, Amelia.
Thank you, Sherry.